Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts, David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's episode, we put Laura Lynch, host of CBC's What on Earth, on the other side of the mic. She tells us about what drove her to create CBC's first show focused on climate change. We also discuss how energy and climate stakeholders can work with the media to better communicate the scientific and economic realities of the energy transition. Now on to the show. Hello and welcome everyone to episode 2 of season 2 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. So if you followed the topics from our previous 11 shows, today is officially our and now for something completely different episode. So we started off Energy versus Climate last year out of the conviction that Canada needs a more realistic and more honest conversation about the trade-offs between energy policy, the economy, and climate protection. And of course, media has an extremely important role to play in helping Canadians and people around the world to have that more realistic and honest dialogue. But actually having it is a lot easier said than done. So today we've decided to veer away from our usual very techie and very geeky topic to talk about how we talk about the science and economics of climate, and particularly through media. So to do that, we're very excited to put Laura Lynch on the other side of the mic from where she normally sits. Laura is, of course, well known to many in our audience as a prominent CBC TV and radio journalist for CBC News. She was a foreign correspondent for many years, using Washington, D.C. and London as launch pads to report from all sorts of hotspots around the world. She was also the long-serving interim host of The Current. And now, which is on point for what we're talking about today, she is the driving force behind a new radio show and podcast on CBC specifically focused on climate change. And it's called What on Earth? And we're fans. So if you haven't already, we urge you to check it out. Welcome, Laura Lynch.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Well, super to have you. So very briefly, the usual housekeeping notes. I'm going to start off today. Sometimes we'll do a primer, but instead today we're going to do a Q&A with Laura. I'm then going to guide us through some of the questions and stories that we all have around the positive and the not so positive experiences in communicating about climate and energy. I'll do that with Laura, Sarah, and David. We'll do that until 30 to 35 minutes past the hour, and then we will take your questions. And as always, you can send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Please do not use the raise hand function or the chat box. And as always, we have the wonderful Mika McFarlane, who's going to help us sort questions, and he's going to help us to pick live questioners as well. So welcome back, Mika. So let's start with our first poll, our first audience poll. Canada needs a more realistic and honest dialogue about the trade-offs between energy policy, the economy, and climate protection. You heard me say that earlier. That is our starting premise for Energy versus Climate. But we've never actually asked you, the viewer and listener, do you agree? So let us know, do you agree or do you disagree? And we'll get to the poll results in just a bit. But let's put Laura again on the other side of the mic from where she normally sits. So Laura, your What on Earth episode from 2 weeks ago was called What an Alberta Controversy Tells Us About Climate Disinformation. It was very much on point for this show, and especially given the conversation that you had with a couple folks Genevieve Gunther of N Climate Science and Sean Holman of Mount Royal University about sort of media communication of climate. But it also reminded me that the last time I was on The Current was when you were a host, and it was on the topic of the Un-Albertan Activities Committee. But let's go back a ways. So you finished off at The Current, and after that, presumably you could have written your own ticket at CBC to do whatever you want. You started What on Earth, which is a show all about communicating climate science, economics, and policy. So pray tell, why did you do that?
And more. We go way beyond that too. We go in, we stray into the arts. We do all sorts of things. Well, after I finished at The Current, I really was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And even before I was finished, went and talked to the bosses and the programmers about doing this. And in particular, doing it from Vancouver, partly because it's home, but partly because we needed to get some voices from outside of central Canada. And this seemed like a good place to do it. I had started out many years ago when I was a cub reporter, as they say, covering the environment out here. And they gave me a green light to put a pilot together. And that was in February. I thought it was timely. I thought it was something that was really missing from what we were talking about at the CBC. In fact, with the pandemic, we really weren't talking about climate change at all. So I didn't hear anything because the pandemic just sort of swept over everything. And then I got a call in June saying, can you do this as a summer series? And we'll give you 3 weeks to get ready. So we met the challenge, and then we got renewed till December, and now we've been renewed until June. And I'm hoping and believing that they can't turn back now, that this is going to be a permanent part of the schedule. And we have a very small team, but every Monday we get together and talk about what's going on around the world, what we can tackle that is timely and relevant for our audience. And we have always kept in mind two things: that we want to deliver the information in a way that resonates with the audience and that is understandable, but also we don't want to just keep it to the science or the economics, even that we need to discuss this sort of in every single part of our lives. And when you look at it that way, there is certainly no end to the possible subjects that we can talk about on this program. And that's what we've been doing. It's been, for me, after all of these years of running around the world, one of the most satisfying things I've ever done as a journalist. And I can really see that it's resonating with people.
Great. So going back to what you said, I know you cover more than just science and economics and policy. You talk about the psychology, even to talk about the emotional impact. But let's go back to, well, actually, let me stop myself. You had your episode a couple of weeks ago. You had the Alberta rancher, John Cross, on, and you asked him, how does he talk about climate to other farmers and ranchers? And his response was, carefully.
Yes.
Carefully. So we, on this show, on Energy versus Climate, we cover some of the same topics, like nuclear or nature-based solutions. But for us, we know that our audience is typically a pretty geeky one. So frankly, like, we don't make many concessions on complexity, save for that we sometimes do kickoff primers. But for your CBC audience, when you're talking about Simon's economics policy, I imagine that, like John Cross said, you have to be careful. So give us a sense of you and your production team. What is your approach for storytelling for pretty complex topics like around science, economics of climate?
Well, I think the only thing that we're careful about is delivering the information in a way that everyone can understand. And so when we do tackle science subjects, we make sure we almost do what you're talking about, which we will normally start off with some kind of a primer or an explainer of exactly what we're talking about. And we will also make sure that when we're talking to scientists or economists, that they speak to us in plain language. I'm really fortunate. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an economist, but on our team, we have Lisa Johnson, who has a background in science. She graduated in sciences before she decided her first love was journalism, and she's tremendous at being able to translate that. Another producer, Molly Siegel, is very steeped in science. She just finished a fellowship at MIT, and she's very good at picking up on the science of it as well. And then there are our other veteran journalists, Rachel Sanders, Jennifer Van Evra, and our senior producer, Manisha Janakaram, who are just have years of experience in taking all kinds of complex issues and being able to deliver them in a way that doesn't talk down to the audience, because you don't want to do that. You don't want to talk down to them. You don't want to hector them because they'll stop listening. But in a way that still is true to the information and the issues that you're trying to deliver. So I consider it to be a small, mighty team that tries to do its best every week. And I think we've been delivering.
Yeah, I think you have. I'm a fan. And again, going back to that show a couple of weeks ago, you had Simon Donner from, I think it's from UBC,
Yes.
if I'm correct. And he used like a CSI crime scene analogy when describing the evidence that humans are having an impact on the climate. He said, like, the fingerprints of humans are all over the crime scene, and it's indisputable we're having an impact. So thinking of that as an example, using those kinds of analogies, like what have you learned about climate energy reporting since June of 2020 through to today, compared to, say, the reporting that you did on wars and conflicts in faraway places? Like, have you got a sense of what resonates with your listeners and readers?
Well, I think it's changing. The longer we go on, I think that people are becoming more aware of the program and more aware of the subject as well. And I just want to jump in here to say that in the time that we've been on the air, we have also seen the Globe and Mail, for example, beef up its climate coverage tremendously, and which is a great thing. The more the merrier. Let's all get in on this. But what I think I've learned is that there is such a broad swathe of things that climate change influences in our lives, things that I'd never thought about before, that I'm learning about every week, and that goes from things that we already know about, such as electric vehicles, which I must tell you had a huge audience reaction, mostly from EV owners who wanted to tell us how much they love their EVs.
Sarah?
And full confession, I just bought one 2 months ago, so first car I've owned in 20 years. But also people want to talk about their own anxieties about climate too, and I think that this kind of gives them an opening to do that. Not just in shows that are specifically aimed at that, but when we talk about things like our last episode, which is actually based in India, but brings it home to Canada, about the fact that climate change is making glaciers melt, which is making mountainsides unstable, which could lead to things like what we saw in India. And it's interesting because we had to be careful about that. We had to say that the scientists aren't yet sure about the role of climate change, but everything points in that direction. So it's an important thing to keep in mind that you can talk about climate change in the midst of all these news events and bring it up and raise it, but also be responsible as a journalist and say when you don't know, when the evidence isn't there, as much as when it is there. I think that goes back to first principles as a journalist, and it's just being reinforced through all of this. And then beyond that, Ed, is just all of the very practical day-to-day things I've learned about home heating and geothermal, which I didn't know anything about before, and how far behind Canada is on that in spite of the fact that we have so much potential for it here in Canada. So much is going on here. And I have received a lot of pitches from people who are trying to start up businesses around this. You wouldn't believe how many that want to come on the show and talk about it. People are doing things, and it's exciting to see that.
Yeah, well, that's great. And when you mentioned geothermal, by the way, you've hit like a hot button topic for us. So as I did last week or 2 weeks ago, yes, Loyal Energy versus Climate viewers, we will do a show on geothermal because that's the one by popular demand. But I want to, so let's get David and Sarah in. And I just want to, so two things. One, sharing the poll results. No surprise. David is sort of teasing me. It's like, I chose the question. Why did you choose that question, Ed? Because it's kind of like a motherhood and apple pie statement. Yes, by selection bias here. If you're showing up, you probably think that we're not having a more realistic and honest dialogue, or enough of a realistic and honest dialogue. So no surprise in the results. The other thing I want to say is we're not talking about social media as much here. We might touch upon it, but I use a Jonathan Haidt analogy. Social media with any issue, especially in the last 10 years, it's kind of like the equivalent of turning up gravity in terms of its effect on issues. So turning up gravity, planes start to fall out of the air and buildings start to topple over. Things just start shifting. And we're seeing that in Canada as well on climate energy. But David, let's start with you and talk about the challenges that you've experienced in as a climate energy policy actor, and one who's very well covered. I had reason to Google you not too long ago, and you had like 25 million hits. So next to Laura, you're probably, you've got you're the most media time of anyone. So what are the challenges you have?
Well, I don't think it's about challenges I have. I think a central challenge is between news and teaching. And I think the media keeps facing that, because what happens is all over the world, over North America, there are scientists who do a great job, but they also have careers. And when they publish a new thing, they need to get it to the university press office, and the university press office wins by getting it reported. And often what's new is really not very important or not very new. And inside the science establishment, it doesn't really look like very much has changed, but those things get reported as the new thing. And I think that shapes the way people think about it. I think it makes people systematically think that climate change science and technology is more rapidly changing than it actually is, maybe less certain than it actually is. So you see this time and time again. Recently I got like several emails from senior reporters about this big new report that said that when emissions really came to zero, the temperatures would stop rising. This is something that's been stable knowledge for 2 decades, maybe closer to 3. From my experience, I've been involved in climate science for 30 years now. Changes have not been very big. And so you get this real gap between the things that if I lecture to first-year students or to experts and say, what are the things you most need to know about climate change? They're very simple. It's a very, very different list than what happens when you turn on the news, which is whatever the last paper was, which is often kind of irrelevant to decisions people have to make.
Mm-hmm. And so I remember hearing you give a lecture about climate science, and one thing that stuck with me was you said the first article in the New York Times that got the science mostly right was in, I think, 1952, and the first report that landed on a president's desk talking about the science and saying we should do something about this was during the Johnson administration.
Yep, 65. Yep.
Yeah. So,
yeah, and if you go back and read the climate reports from like the National Academy Report in 82 or even the 1977 Academy Report, it's not that. The fundamentals are there. And it really is. And I think the other thing you got to be careful of is to pick up on something you just said, Laura, is a question about fractional attribution. So in science, often people win and get their paper published if they can show there's some attributable function of climate change, but it may be small. So when you talk about landslides, and I am no expert, this is just pure guess, about landslides in that part of Asia, but I've traveled, talked to people. My guess is the risk is dominated by changes in land use and changes in land cover. And yes, I'm sure climate will contribute principally through higher max precip, but it's important to sort of think about how big that contribution is compared to other contributions.
Great. Sarah, talk about the challenges that you've experienced, because you've been up and down media for years as well.
Yes, I want to pick up on something that David said, and then I have another kind of pointer on the time. And I think this question of really understanding how science works is something that's really challenging to then report on. And I don't actually think, as a scientist, as someone who is a practicing scientist, I don't actually think it's because, you have to be so smart or it's so hard to understand the way that science works. I think about it a little bit like a foreign language. If I started talking in German now, most of the people I imagine on this podcast wouldn't understand me. And so you might say, well, that's really, hard and no one can understand that. But of course, a young child would understand me if we were sitting in Germany. And I think there's something very similar around science. Science is not inherently, I think, any more complicated to understand than, anything else that we learn, but it gets sort of shrouded in this like mystery. And it's these, men in white coats that are doing this stuff and everybody else wouldn't be able to understand. And so I think that's, that probably goes back even much further than the media into the education system and the way that we teach what science is. So maybe we need another show on that. But I think that's one component of just that kind of scientific literacy that isn't part of really a general public's understanding of the way that science is done. And that gets at, I think, a lot of what David is saying around what's, new versus what's already understood and building upon, previous theories. The one that I've come across with, I think, a lot in my own experience and challenges is really one just of time, right? And how do you communicate a complex subject in a short amount of time? And I mean, I think that's part of why, we're excited about doing EVC, because we get a full hour. Even that feels short sometimes. But I compare that to, when I've done TV news, which I think is I find the most challenging and probably least favorite. And, you literally get maybe a few sentences that end up in the story. And so it's really hard, especially when we're talking about complex topics, to kind of give anything other than a very headline piece of news within that time. And I think that's really difficult because for many of the topics that we're talking about, and a lot of what we try to get into here, it's not as simple as that. And there are real concerns, if we're talking about renewable energy and the minerals that we need to extract to build them, there are real legitimate concerns around that need to be addressed. At the same time, that doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense to move forward. And it isn't, going to be better kind of in our overall impact to do so. But you kind of have a choice then within this short amount of time of either just, kind of saying, oh, it's all fine, or you have to bring up some of these issues and you sort of risk that then that becomes the story. And so I think as someone who, is sometimes trying to communicate within the structures that exist, I have a hard time figuring out what to talk about and how to fit that within the time.
Yeah. It's interesting because it does really depend on the medium itself. Like for me, when I do TV, because I did media training decades ago and learned that, you've got about 7 seconds at best that's going to make it on the clip. And so hit your sound point again and again and again. I become very disciplined and I get my hands in the TV box and, you kind of look wooden, but you keep hitting the same message. When I do a longer form interview, then at times I'm incapable of speaking like a real human being because I'm not disciplined. And I remind myself of the Onion Network News that ran a parody headline that was titled "Obama's Home Teleprompter Malfunctions During Family Dinner." And it left him incapable of having a normal conversation with his family. And sometimes I feel that way with journalists when I don't have that 7-second discipline forced on me to just try to hit the main point and hit it again and again. But Laura, I mean, again, you sit normally on the other side of the mic. Yeah. So when you're talking to Sarah or you're talking to David and it's a 30-second clip or it's a longer 10-minute clip, like what are the challenges that you have when dealing with actors like the two of them?
So just let me say, first of all, I understand your frustration with the 7-second clip, because if you're any kind of a good journalist, then you're absolutely frustrated that you have 2 minutes to tell a complex story. The other thing I'll say, Sarah, is that the mystique that you kind of described around the way scientists speak or communicate. I went to law school. Lawyers do the same thing. And I have the benefit of understanding that language and that form of communication. And it absolutely helps me to communicate when I'm doing a legal story to demystify that. So I think that for me, when I'm speaking to a scientist, if they can just think about the subject that they're talking to me about and really think about communicating it in everyday language, scrub the, like David just said when he was talking about India, he said max precip. And I understood what he's saying, but it's and I say to my colleagues on the show, cliche alert or scientific language alert, we're going to get those out of the show, because you absolutely have a way to describe it that's non-scientific. And the more you can do that, the more you're actually going to reach more and more people. I don't know what the answer is to trying to only dealing with a story in 7 seconds, except rest assured that especially these days, there's so many other venues for you to share your information. Look at this podcast, for example. Can you imagine that? Even 5-10 years ago, the TV newscast is not, dare I say this, as influential as it used to be. You can speak to an audience that is coming to you because they're already engaged on the topic. They want to hear about this. So you have the benefit of that. And all I would urge scientists to do is become as good communicators as they can possibly be. I can help with that. I can be the one who says, wait, I don't really understand that. Can you say that again? But the more that the scientists can bring it to the table and communicate it in a way that somebody like me can understand, then I'm going to make sure that the audience understands that too. And then we all win.
Yeah. By the way, I remember the the aquatics biologist, David Schindler, telling me and listening to a talk, and I complimented on how well he communicated. He's an academic. And he said, yeah, I've got in my department about 52 profs. I would trust 2 of them to actually go out and communicate the research, and I'm one of them. Yeah. because it's so much is lost in translation. But sorry, I want to pick up on something in the tension around now, taking science, or as a journalist, and doing what Genevieve Gunther and Sean Holman told you a couple episodes ago. Mm-hmm. They said the mainstream news media is not doing a good enough job explaining the science and failing to connect the dots between climate change and things like extreme weather events. Mm-hmm. And I used to hear a woman, her name is Heather Mack. She was the Insurance Bureau of Canada. I loved it because she would talk about extreme weather events and disasters here in Alberta. And she would always connect those dots. That's when I was ahead of Pembina, got her to Pembina events. That suited our advocacy objectives. But let's go back. And David, we had this conversation, David and Sarah, before we opened the webinar about the New York Times today and doing exactly that. And David, what did you say about that story and how it's going too far in connecting the dots between climate and extreme weather?
Well, so it said something about predictability. It said the weather was becoming less predictable. And I believe there's no evidence for that at all. I've never seen a paper. I mean, of course, weather prediction accuracy is going up and up and up. And I'm trying to think of whether there's a reason that weather prediction accuracy would be lower in a warmer world. It actually there's factors that go both ways. I've never seen a serious analysis. So there's a bunch of stuff people say that just is not tied to reality. And as you know, Ed, I mean, extremes are a factor, but not a really strong factor. They're one of the big ones. I think the big issues here are understanding the energy system. And I guess my question for you, Laura, is how much you think about the tension between the teaching and the news mode. So how much in constructing your program, you have a list of like, what are the key things that people need to know to be good citizens here? Mm-hmm. And obviously we can't just teach them. We're a news program, but how much do we kind of have a matrix over 6 months of our program about what are the key things people really need to know versus what are the exciting things that'll draw them in, that are fun stories or interesting personalities or things that appear to be news?
Boy, I don't think any of that is mutually exclusive. I really don't. I think that our challenge and our responsibility is to take those heavy subjects and make sure they're presented in a way that is something that the audience really wants to listen to, that is, at its best, journalism is storytelling. Mm-hmm. And there is a way I say this as many, many years in this business, there is a way to make almost any story a model of storytelling that is engaging to people. And we try to do that every week. I'm not sure that we always make that happen, but we certainly do that through, we consider every week what we call the heartbeat of the story, which is how it affects an individual or a group of people in their lives, in their day-to-day lives. Like our lovely rancher who wants to speak to others about climate change very carefully.
But what I was asking was I think those aren't necessarily intention, but I was asking is to what extent it's structuring like a 6-month run of a series like this. How much do you think about these are some key things that citizens need to know that I'd like to teach? And obviously I got to match that to stories that are driven by people or a news item or what have you.
So I don't consider myself teaching, but I just want to say that. But unfortunately, David, we've been in this kind of holding pattern. I mean, initially we thought we were going to be a 9-week program.
Yeah, fair enough.
And so we actually planned those 9 weeks out. And I think the last one was about decarbonization. That was going to be our big send-off. And then we found out that we were going to be carrying on until Christmas. So we planned out a little more until Christmas time. And then we got extended to June. So we're doing this again. There's not as much whiteboard planning as you might expect. There have been extra challenges in doing the program because of the pandemic. But we try, so I'll tell you, we kind of have the show planned out about 3 weeks ahead right now. And last week we pivoted because of what happened in India and did something completely different. So I don't think we don't do it like as a teacher would. We don't have a lesson plan for the session. What we're trying to do is pick topics that we think are important, complex. We don't shy away from that. That resonate with an audience. And we also keep in mind that even though we can be heard around the world, that we are speaking to Canadians. Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that it is something that is relevant to them in their everyday lives. So I'm not sure that that's a satisfying answer, David, but that's kind of the way we tackle things. Maybe if we get put on permanently, we can cast our net out for about a year and see what we can do.
Yeah, I'm just realizing, Laura.
The tension is between thinking, I mean, you said you're not a teacher, but I feel like that's got to be part of the role of something that's not pure day-to-day reporting. And there's got to be some kind of filter that says, what are things that really informed citizens need to know here versus what are the topical stories? And,
right.
Say in that India case, does what box is that checking?
Right.
Yeah.
And in that case, we did have a long talk about it because we were back and forth about doing it at the beginning of the week. And going for a story that far away was unusual for us as well. But we thought because of what it had to say about something that does happen far away and what relevance it has here was something important to tackle. But I consider you the teacher. If you come on the show, then you get to be the teacher, David, and you can help our listeners understand.
No, because you picked the topic. No, not at all.
It's
really important to say it's completely different.
When
I'm invited to speak to people about what matters about climate change, it's completely different from when I talk to the press.
I'm the gatekeeper. I am absolutely the gatekeeper, and I acknowledge how much power I have in that role, and I take it very seriously. So.
No, I'm often, most times, talking to the press about things I think are unimportant because they've driven it, and I try and steer it to what I think is important. But that's the issue.
Yeah, and so I want to take it a step further, and before we turn to Q&A, I want to talk about polarization because we're dealing in a hyper-polarized environment right now. We are apparently post-truth and post-fact. Sarah, I take you did a 1 hour, noon hour CBC radio call-in show last week or the week before on GM's announcement to move to fully electric production by 2035. And sure enough, you sort of, treaded upon the polarized environment that we have where people aren't talking about EVs, but they're talking about, well, this has got to be a pinko lefty socialist scheme to basically transition me out of a job. So when you're doing these longer pieces, like how are you cutting through the polarization when people are coming in and already they have a frame, they have a bias, and a lot of them are angry?
Yeah, so I think how you do it. I think a big part of that to me is understanding where people are coming from and understanding, like in the cases of misinformation, where that misperception is coming from. I think one of the challenges, and I'm by no means great at this, but one of the things that I've had to learn over the years is that there is an element of that comes from, the scientific facts and being able to point to, kind of hard evidence, but there's also, more to it than that as well, right? You have to kind of somehow connect to the topic, not just on that, purely data-driven level. And I think that's especially hard, when you're sort of wearing a scientist hat, because that's not necessarily the way that scientists are communicating around, an experiment that they're doing. One of the questions that I guess I have for Laura around the misinformation piece is, I find it frustrating when I see, and this is going on live right now, right, with what's going on in Texas, which is a really horrible tragedy. And I'm, I know there's a lot of people there working to get the power back on, and hopefully they'll be successful very soon. But you see already, all of a sudden, everybody is an electricity system expert. And there's headlines everywhere about how, it's because of frozen wind turbines is why the power went out in Texas. And of course, that's overly simplistic and really not the whole story. But there is, it seems to me that there's often so much incentive for people to kind of flood the space with misinformation and not a lot of disincentive to do that. And so how do, how do journalists, especially in kind of reporting on events like these when the time is very short, and I imagine there's all kinds of people telling you, different things that are the truth. How do you respond to that? And how do you view this kind of challenge of, at least of what I see is the misinformation that comes through?
Are you talking then about the hard news reporting, the breaking news of the moment?
Yeah, because I think that does actually then, I mean, it's not specifically climate, but it actually often has a lot to do with climate and energy these days.
I can speak from my years of I've done disaster reporting before. I've covered the aftermath of a horrible earthquake in Pakistan that killed so many people and flattened entire villages. And you're there in the middle of it trying to give the best information that you can. And my view was always to tell the stories of the people on the ground and let the people back in the desk in Toronto deal with the wider picture, because they're in a much better position to do that. I'm not dodging this. I think that they call journalism the first draft of history, right? And it's a first draft. It's not the finished product, and it was never meant to be. And yeah, there's probably going to be not the best information in that moment. And I would love to believe that our audience, especially a CBC audience, has the smarts to be able to look around to different outlets and different information to be able to come to more educated conclusions about what is really going on. Because, I mean, David rightly is raising questions about that New York Times report, but at least the reporter did link the event to climate change. Didn't get it right entirely, but look around, see where the reporting is coming from, see what the information is. Use your own smarts to analyze it, and don't believe the first thing that you read or the first thing that you see on television. Be smart enough, or read it in paper or online. Be smart enough to be a smart news consumer. And I've been saying that for decades. It doesn't just happen about climate change, it happens about everything. And I know we're not talking about social media, but social media has been hugely, to me, destructive to having those kinds of complex conversations and looking for answers. Because you follow on social media the people you want to follow.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like, as I mentioned, Jonathan Haidt, it's turning up the gravity. But sir, I want to challenge you on something, Laura, because I think you said you assume that, the CBC viewer or listener is checking out other media sources.
I'd like to believe that, yes.
Would like to believe that, because I assume they're not. Like, I assume these days, with people being busy and with so much on social media, that they might go to one conventional trusted mainstream media source, and the rest they're going to Facebook or Twitter and not necessarily through to the original sources.
Yeah, you're right. But what I'm saying is I'd like to believe that that CBC listeners and CBC viewers care enough to want to learn more about something. I mean, maybe that's not true these days. I think it was probably true in the past. What I do feel fortunate about is that our program starts from the premise that climate change is real, that climate change is caused by human activity. So we don't have to be trying to do false balance and defend that every single week. We start from that as our beginning point.
Yeah. And sorry, just a quick question then. By principle, you won't have someone on your show who says, climate change is a crock of bull. It's part of the Great Reset. It's a conspiracy.
Well, that's what that's called false balance, to put those views on the air when we know that they are not true. And that episode that you're talking about, the episode before last, we were tackling that very subject about the fact that these papers that have been filed with the inquiry in Alberta were classic climate denial papers. We didn't have the authors of the papers on. We talked about what those papers represent in the discussion about climate change around the world.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I think the harder question there is that the core climate science is robust, but the question of how we report on impacts and how we balance reporting on negative impacts versus positive, I think, is really tough. I mean, the fact is the kind of absolute state-of-the-art econometric evidence about climate impacts suggests that a country like Canada benefits for a while. That's, to me, not a reason that's true in aggregate, but I think that we, most reporters systematically don't cover that very much. We don't think about those shifts. And I think that's a tough one because that is in the realm of normal science. It's just a part of it we don't talk about.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I've broken my promise. I said we'd get to Q&A by 30 to 35 minutes past the hour and 40. So let's get to Q&A because we've got a bunch. And we're going to go to John Bradford first, who's got a question. So Mika, you can unmute John, and welcome, John.
Yeah, thank you. So the title of your series or of this program is Energy versus Climate, and that really highlights the conflict that many perceive as inherent in the energy transition that we're going through. Really, we have to change the public discussion to one that's focused on cooperation and compromise to get to good policy solutions. So, the commercial media at least tends towards highlighting the conflict because that's what sells. But I think the media and the commercial media is a necessary partner in changing the narrative from one of conflict to one of cooperation. So how can we transform the media mindset or culture to one that highlights this need for cooperation?
Great. Thanks, John. I'd like to go to Laura, but I do want to say, I don't think we've ever fully explained our title, and I don't plan on it now. Maybe we do an episode on it. All I can say is it's the verses is purposeful. Some people love it. Some people hate it. But they pay attention, which is what we're hoping for. So, Laura, you want to weigh in?
Well, the thing is with our show, and this was also explicit from the start, was that our show was going to look at potential solutions. We were not going to highlight the conflict. We were going to highlight the impact and then look at potential solutions and put them out there, scrutinize them, and let the listeners decide what they thought of them. So I think we're actually doing what John is talking about. And I think John may be referring to other mainstream commercial media outlets that think they'll get more clicks from conflict. I can't speak to the way they do things. As I said, the Globe and Mail is putting a lot more resources into climate change coverage now. And I suspect you'll see that happening more and more often. That probably is or is coming around to that idea of looking at the cooperation between parties instead of the conflict between parties. John, I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you're talking about.
Well, Laura, David and Sarah both want to get in.
Yeah.
So let's go for them. And yeah, just shout out around the globe, Adam Radwanski is doing fantastic work, definitely. Amongst many, but he's doing very good work. David.
I think it's two halves the same thing. I think we should emphasize the way that social cooperation is necessary to solve the problem and that there are lots of great examples of that cooperation emerging. But I also think it's important to be honest about the fact that there is an essential tension here, that actually decarbonizing at the speed we'd want to deal with climate change really will be hard for the energy system. And there are sharp energy versus climate trade-offs between access to cheap energy, especially for the world's poorest, and what we do to really decarbonize fast. And I think the fact that the trade-offs are real, that there's an inherent push me, pull you, doesn't mean that we have to settle it all by conflict. But pretending that there isn't an actual push me, pull you, it seems to me, is a recipe for bad policy and bad social resolution.
Great. Sarah?
Yeah, I think there will, it's sort of echoing David's point, but I think there will be winners and losers as we go through an energy transition. And, I think within Alberta, there's been, or at least I've observed, sort of a shift from kind of, okay, we're not going to do this at all. Climate change is not real. We're not going to transition, to one where we say, okay, well, it is real and we're going to adjust, but we're going to do so in a way that brings everyone along. And inherent in that everyone is not just, the people of Alberta, where we have a responsibility to really bring them along, but sort of applying that, companies and investors and all of these people are going to continue to, be just as prosperous as they were before. And I think that's where, we need to be really thoughtful about where that cooperation and compromise will happen and where that tension exists. And I think we're getting a little bit, to me, stuck in that second phase in the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move us along. I want to read a question, and then we're going to get to another live questioner. So the question is from Lorelei Hansen. Thank you. This is presumably first crack to you, Laura. Why does the CBC always include a business segment in newscasts, but they don't have an environmental clip that is featured every weekday? I love that What on Earth exists, but this program alone suggests that environmental issues are a niche subject instead of the very foundation of life and of concern to us all.
Okay, okay, here I go. I'm going to defend the whole CBC now.
Yes,
You're responsible
yes, it's
for
all
all of
resting
it.
on you, Laura. It's all
You're
resting on
responsible
you.
for all of CBC.
Lorelei.
Save the budget.
Lorelei or Lorelei. I'm not sure how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. And in fact, we had a conversation with our own team about something that the Victoria morning, you're talking about the local morning shows, I'm virtually certain. And the Victoria Morning Show actually does a climate check-in every single morning. They look at the carbon measurements year over year, every single morning. And we talked about trying to do that on the show, but we can't practically do it because we're week to week and we get heard at different times. So there wasn't a comparative way to do that. But I thought that that's great that they do it. I'd love to see more of that because you're right. We do have dedicated business segments every morning on the show. I think we could benefit from having something like that on the air every week. In the CBC's defense, we too, it was not just this show, have substantially beefed up our climate change coverage. We have a dedicated team in the newsroom now doing climate news. And we had our first editorial board last week, which was terrific. And we're going to be doing more of that. We also want to be the go-tos for other journalists who are looking for contacts or information around stories that they're doing within the CBC where they might need a little helping hand getting things done or finding someone to talk to. So yeah, we're not there. And other media outlets are not there. And I am just so glad and grateful that we've been able to make the step forward with having our show on the air and hopefully being able to lead the way in better and better coverage here at the CBC and elsewhere.
Yeah,
that sounds very conceited, but I'm hoping that's true.
No, but let's acknowledge it is a first. It's a first for CBC, and then probably, unless I've got it wrong, in Canada, the first for any major media company.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Sarah.
I love this question because I think to me, it really encompasses the shift that we need to have in our understanding of the way that climate and environment issues impact the economy and the world in which we live in. And I see this, this is a shift that's happened within many of the major companies that really, when I was working with them 10 years ago, had sustainability people, but they kind of sat over to the side and it was like this box to check and you maybe trotted them in to, say something nice about the panda bears or something, but they weren't, fundamentally part of the business. And I think that what we're seeing is that has very much shifted within the business community to realizing that climate and the environment are not a nice to have on the side, but they are as core and fundamental to the issues that businesses are facing as any other that they're working on. And I think that's not yet always reflected in the way that our systems are organized within media and with reporting. And that's, to me, that's really, really the key because that's where it becomes real. And you hear in more and more these issues of people saying things like, well, climate finance is now just finance. And this sort of, that climate has become integrated and become a real thing when the climate label goes away and it becomes part of the core issues on which people are making decisions. And so I think that to me is, when we reach that point, and I think we are getting closer, we are doing a good job of communicating how climate and energy issues are going to shape our economy going forward.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in. I had a conversation last week with an old Pembina colleague from way back, like Pembina Institute 20 years ago. And we were joking, he said, remember when what we did, the work we did was fringe and now we're mainstream. So hopefully it's not too late, but certainly there's a huge focus on it. A couple of things I just want to say. So absolutely correct. Kudos to the CBC for What on Earth. Let's not forget that some smaller publications have been doing this for a while, and a particular shout out to the Narwhal as one. And this other point is going to sound ironic coming from me, but let's also be wary of climate representing this all sort of consuming this all sucking sound and hoovering up all the attention on environmental issues. Because I say this thinking of a piece I read recently by the American novelist Jonathan Franzen, and I'm a big fan. Like me, he's a birder. And he was critical of the Audubon Society in the US for pivoting its communication from bird conservation to climate. And suddenly it's like, you want to save birds, you have to invest in climate mitigation. And question that, going back to the science, saying, I don't think there's anything in the short term that we can do on climate that's going to save a single bird. So let's be careful about just hopping on the topic du jour, which reminds me of the conversation we had about nature-based solutions and that tension between using climate as leverage just to drive money to good old-fashioned conservation. Okay, now we've got 10 minutes left. A favorite of Energy versus Climate, Robert Tremblay. You write good questions, Robert. So would like to turn to you
Thanks.
to pose your question.
Okay, so this one's for everyone. So what are some energy and climate topics that you think still have a large gap between public understanding and the energy and climate reality? What needs to be done to bridge these gaps?
David, you surely you want to talk about solar geo here.
No, I was thinking about energy system basics. I think my guess is that there's a bunch of, when I teach classes, I often have a quiz zero where I ask people a bunch of questions off the top, like what is the overall efficiency of electricity transmission in North America? What fraction of power is lost in electricity? And people routinely, you get sort of wildly stupid answers about that, or wrong answers, with a significant fraction of people thinking the loss are 50% when they're actually only 6%. And I think teaching the basics of how energy flows through the system and powers the modern world is the most important single thing for understanding the trade-offs in driving down emissions.
I like that answer. I would follow it up with like thermodynamics, right? I've seen a lot of like surprised reactions recently to, Sankey charts that show how energy flows. Exactly. And people seem shocked to learn, how much of the thermal energy when we're burning fossil fuels goes to heat that's not converted to useful energy. And I mean, these are really, it's on us for not teaching that. But those are some pretty basic things that if you're thinking about, electrifying a system, that matters a lot because you're going to gain, a few factors in efficiency when you electrify your system. And so suddenly that challenge looks less difficult. And so I just put my vote, perhaps unsurprisingly, also into the basics and the physics behind it.
And Sarah, do you remember
by going back up the chain, saying if you turn on the light, what's the chain all the way back to what happens? And the same for driving. And I think the other part of that is to really try and get people to understand how hard it is and what the hard trade-offs are going to be of really driving emissions down fast.
Yeah, two things, Sarah. I mean, you remember when you kicked off the hydrogen episode by saying hydrogen's an energy carrier. It's not an energy source. When people get irrationally exuberant around what we could do with hydrogen. But Laura, I mean, coming back to you, what do you think? Like maybe this point around how hard it is to get to net zero. I mean, if you say that now, when I talk about it, and I talk about it publicly, and I talk about being not at all optimistic that we're going to get to net zero, not at all optimistic we're going to get to 2030. On one hand, I run the risk of just feeding, frankly, the right-wing trolls, or I'd say the anti-climate trolls, who are saying, yeah, we shouldn't bother, versus the people on the left who are saying, I've got this wonderful portfolio of solutions that I'm advocating for, and you've just cut the legs out from beneath me.
Well, I just, first of all, David and Sarah, take notes, do those shows that you're recommending because they sound great. David, I love that idea of tracing something back from the light switch. That sounds like a great way to tell a story. We did do an episode of, and this isn't specifically to this person's question. We've done a lot of different things. We've done hydrogen, we've done nuclear, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't mean it's the last time we'll visit any of those. But we also did an episode about the language of climate change and the words that people use. And it was an interesting discussion. And Zeke Hausfather was, I don't know if you know him, was on the show with his point of view that if you are saying that it's impossible to get to where we want to be, then you risk people saying, well, why would I bother even trying? I'm not going to win. We're not going to win this climate change fight. So I'm just not going to do anything anymore and just sort of be a fatalist about it. When he believes there are things you can do to improve the situation, even though you may not get to your stated goals soon enough. But at the same time, you're right. You need to talk frankly and honestly about the trade-offs, about, as Sarah said, the winners and the losers. We did do an episode recently on the so-called just transition in Canada. We've yet to see the federal government's legislation on that. But trying to be honest about the kinds of sacrifices that are going to have to be made if we're going to actually even get partway, Ed, to what you say we are not going to make it to. So I'm not sure that that's a satisfactory answer, but I just think that we have to keep on trucking with all of this and keep going with it. And as we go along, more people sort of join in and start thinking about it, and maybe are getting more and more prepared to make sacrifices, as our rancher was.
Well, I think it's the essence of the trade-off, and where there is any room for real social agreement, is both to say it's hard, but it's doable.
Yeah.
And I think what doesn't work is to oversell either. If you just say it's all easy, a whole bunch of people just dismiss you. Clearly, if you say it's impossible, you shouldn't do anything, a bunch of people dismiss you. I think the key, honest truth is to get in that middle ground.
Right.
It's hard and it's doable, but as soon as you start layering in economic and social acceptance constraints, it goes from hard to being very, very hard. And let's admit, like we had our conversation with Mark Jackard 2 weeks ago, and no one was at all confident that we're going to come close to our 2030 targets, including our audience of, several hundred people. So I want to pick up though on Laura on your point, like just transition. So again, what's easy with just transition? We're awaiting the legislation. Helping a worker to transition to another career and to become a remote web designer instead of a coal worker is really hard. What have governments done? Cutting billion-dollar checks to keep coal companies whole is easy. So they go with what's easy. The question that we have, or a couple questions, I'm combining them. One is, Trump was successful in talking to those coal workers and promising something that he could not deliver upon. But one saying climate science is a bunk, it's a lot of bunk, and I'm going to bring your jobs back. And then this one, going back to John Cross, we have another, thank you, Wayne Patton, for that first question. Karen Spencer is like, how do we have that safe space? How do we create the safe space for conversations with people who are in transitioning industries? So two-parter, how do we bring in more people, not just the dyed-in-the-wool energy versus climate, what on earth listeners and viewers? And then two, going back to John Cross, how do we actually speak to them in a way that they're going to listen to when probably their starting point is they're scared and they're mad?
Mm-hmm. That's for me, is it? That's easy.
Well, that's for anyone, but we're going to take advantage of you being here, Laura.
Let me see. So we had, I don't know if you know Leah Stokes. She's
we had her on the show.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So we move around in the same circles. Leah wrote this wonderful piece in which she describes, she talks about climate change all the time. She gets in the taxi, she talks to the taxi driver. She's talking to everyone she possibly can about it. And I think in that, even if it sounds incremental, that's the way you do it. And you don't do it in a confrontational way. You just start having the conversations. Social media, again, I don't think is friendly to that kind of conversation. That's going to be usually confrontational. The smaller conversations are what can really have an effect on people, and they're quite powerful. Larger gatherings have an ability to do that too, if the parameters are set out that we're going to have a conversation about this, and we're not going to shout at each other about this. I think I've found in the people that we've talked to on the program who fear what it will mean to their personal lives, they come by that honestly. They're not trying to be destructive. And you have to understand what is at stake for them in all of this. But they are people who are willing to listen just as much as they are willing to talk. And the discussion, I think, is not only crucial, but it's also important to have respect for everyone who's around the table on this. And to challenge when challenge is needed. I did a long interview with Jonathan Wilkinson just before Christmas.
Yep.
And I didn't shy away from challenging him on a lot of things. We could have talked even longer. But those are the people who deserve to be challenged, the politicians, the one who are carrying out the policy here, constantly about what climate change is going to mean to Canadians in terms of policies and sacrifices. But in terms of the everyday person, these are just, I would like to say, more intimate conversations that can help bespeak a broader evolution in people's thinking.
Great. And just on the challenge, exactly, completely fair game to challenge Jonathan Wilkinson. Fair game. We get a lot of challenges, but just so people know, and it's no one tuning in, when you send us ugly hate emails telling us what we can do and, making comments about our families and whatnot, we stop listening. And I say that because we've all get it, and you can only be an environmentalist in Alberta for so long before you get that kind of stuff. And Laura, I'm sure you're not immune from it as well. I've
certainly heard it about one of the producers on the show lives in Alberta, and her conversations are much different than they are out here in BC.
Absolutely.
Or at least in my part of BC, I should say.
Yeah. Yes. Sarah.
So I think a big thing is recognizing that, yes, this is hard. Anything worth doing is hard, but we are trying to build a system that's better and better for all people. And so this idea of just transition, it's really important to be thinking about folks that are going to be impacted because they have, good paying jobs now. But I think there's broader attention being paid to the ways in which this, kind of energy transition or energy shift can really help those who are not well served by our current system. And so it's a delicate matter because it's a matter, of course, of, respecting what we have and what that's built, but at the same time, acknowledging that we can improve on it and that there are really horrible, examples of environmental injustice going on in the system that we have today. And so to kind of say that, what we've reached now is the ultimate peak, and therefore we shouldn't change it at all, is quite dismissive to that. And so I think there's a lot of people that can be, that you can connect to people around that topic as well too. So realizing we're short on time, I'll stop there. But I think there's much more in that Leah Stokes and others have written about under that environmental justice framing. That I think is quite important.
David, any final comments?
Sure. I mean, a quick one on environmental justice. This is where the conflicts are so tough, because it really is true that there's, of order 7-10 million people a year killed by fine particulate air pollution, lots in the poor world, and especially women indoors cooking on fires that don't use fossil. And I think it's both true that fossil is a huge impact, but it's also true that for some of the world's poorest, getting quick access to fossil energy would actually be their quickest pathway out of energy poverty. And I think that tension is something we're often not that honest about.
Sounds like something for a future show, because I think there's a lot to unpack there around, what can you get access to most quickly? And
yeah, we can think of all sorts of speakers for that show. Let's close off the last poll. So this is, I'll call it the Gunther Holman hypothesis from a couple of shows ago. Is the media doing a good job communicating the scientific and economic realities of energy transition? You'll say that, well, most of you, 4/5, not doing a good job. 1/5 of you think it's doing a good job, all things considered. You can interpret all things considered as you wish, but it's also really looking at the fiscal constraints that media outlets like the CBC face these days. But this is a massive vote for more What on Earth and more Laura Lynch, because we all think you're doing great work.
Thanks.
And we want you to keep doing it. And we're so thankful, Laura, that your show was renewed for season 2. Like, we were thankful we're into season 2, but it's like catching the dog catching the car, creates a lot of work. Yep. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we had a great conversation.
Thank you. My pleasure. It really has been a great conversation. And David and Sarah will be in touch on your ideas.
That's good.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's more of the dog catching the car in this case. So final comments, as always, will be a podcast version will be available at energyversusclimate.com or on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. We'll be back on March 5th for our first of 2 in-conference shows this season. And the first one being at the Solar Alberta Conference. And by in-conference, we're doing an Energy versus Climate episode within their conference. You can give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. And thanks, as always, to 2 people in particular, our very patient producer, Eva Voinigescu, and to Mika McFarlane for his superb webinar support. So thanks. We look forward to seeing you again on March 5th. Thanks again to Laura. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.